I mean, when I started working in OpenStack, the sort of the dream was to create an alternative to the big tech sort of hyperscale clouds. And that's still the dream. And I think we did kind of achieve it. There's not really a singular hyperscale, but there's a lot of companies and governments and research institutions all still using OpenStack. So, I mean, I think we accomplished it.
Hi, welcome to the G-Research Open Source Software Outreach Podcast, the GR-OSS OUT Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Faulkner, and I'm here today to bring you a chat with someone who I've actually known for a long, long time. One of the people who, was a leader in OpenStack when I was first getting involved, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about how Ironic's evolved in that time. But I'm happy to introduce from my standpoint, the original creator of Ironic. But I'm sure she's got more important things she's doing these days to tell you about too. Æva Black. So thanks for being here, Æva.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Jay. It's great to see you again. It's been a long time since we all worked on Ironic together. I think my last code contributions were like 2016 or so it's been almost 10 years.
I've got a couple of bugs, or hey, if you want to get back involved, I've got just the on-ramp.
I think about it. Yeah, I miss writing code.
Garrett's the saying, you just got to learn how to sign off your patches instead of signing the CLA. It's all fine. But you've done a lot more than just Ironic. So why don't you, tell us about, maybe some of your more recent work. And, if, I know some people have a handle, like I'm JF in some communities. If you've got something that other folks might know you by and you want to say that here, please do.
Æva Black, pretty much everywhere. For a while, I spelled it with the two different letters, AE, and now I just spell it with the double vowel A. That's really it. Haven't changed anything else since the OpenStack days. Yeah. But yeah, gosh, I've done a lot of things since then.
Yeah, like what are your current projects? Since you've not been working on Ironic since 2026, I know you've kind of been on the speaker circuit a little bit. What have they? What are you kind of engaged in these days?
Well, probably helpful to do a quick rock skipping over the various things I've done since then. I tried my hand running a cloud hosting company for a little while using OpenStack, and then I took a break for a little while. And then I got hired at Microsoft. And in 4 years at Microsoft, I went from working in the confidential computing team to leading open source security policy within the CTO's office in Azure. And then from there, also kind of went to work for the Biden administration. The government called. That was interesting. And so I led open source security policy for CISA for about a year and a half, about 2 years. And now I'm working in Europe, also still on open source security policy and supply chain security for open source communities over here. It's independent. Okay.
I think I've got questions that might tag into all of those, and we'll sort of maybe walk through the history. So I've always been really curious about cloud hosting. I feel like the economics on that has to be really rough. So were there a misconception or expectation you had going into that maybe the real world sort of proved wrong or that influenced you in that direction?
Yeah. I mean, when I started working in OpenStack, the sort of the dream was to create an alternative to the big tech sort of hyperscale clouds. And that's still the dream. And I think we did kind of achieve it. There's not really a singular hyperscale, but there's a lot of companies and governments and research institutions all still using OpenStack. So, I mean, I think we accomplished the mission. But in probably about 2015, 2016, it became clear to me that the economic incentives of the companies building OpenStack and contributing at the time were really not aligned with competing with a hyperscaler. They were aligned at capturing the middle of the market.
It's definitely interesting. I like that you use the term hyperscaler because we use, this term like giant scale, cloud scale, web scale used to be the thing for a while.
Sure.
And I don't think people really have and when I say people, I'm going to include myself in this. I've not worked at a place like that would be considered a hyperscaler like a Google or Microsoft. I think it's hard to internalize how different the approaches become.
Yes, it is.
So with sort of the placement of OpenStack in the market, is there room in the market for an open source hyperscale level cloud software suite or tools to back that, or is it inherently going to be stuck to business processes of those large companies?
The degree of supply chain integration necessary to compete with a modern day hyperscaler and to catch up to the 20 years of investment lead that they have in building those specific business processes, supply chains, and integrated practices that enable them to get that kind of efficiency. I struggle to think of any country catching up today that isn't already in the game.
It is interesting to me because I've noticed that at places I've worked at that have been at the higher scale, it's almost like the open source software is less central to what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're at a place that's at a medium or kind of smaller scale, you might look and see like maybe an OpenStack cluster is the center of that environment. Whereas if you go to a place like in my experience, that one of the largest scaled places I've worked at is Yahoo. And what you kind of see is that the open source tools that maybe you're used to running the world at a smaller scale are relegated to being tools to serve some other larger business tool or business interest. And it almost flips it on its head because as a technologist, you might go in with the naive thought of technology leading the way, but at that scale, it's all about business needs and business processes and making the software serve those rather than adjusting the business to fit what the software expects, which I think is more of the model at lower scale.
I would agree. And I think we're going to see an interesting inflection in Europe. There's a renewed interest, renewed investment in Europe using open source software to build digital sovereignty. And that's running into political headwind, business headwind, and supply chain challenges already.
Yeah, this is actually great because you've worked a lot in open source supply chain. I gave a talk in Paris. From when we're talking a couple weeks ago, by the time this is posted, probably a couple of months ago, talking about how something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is it's not just for that kind of digital sovereignty. You don't just need to run open source software. You have to contribute to it, and you have to ensure that the critical actions are happening. The example that I pointed at there was the fact that and at Paris, we have volunteers who are changing this, but the majority of the active members of the vulnerability management team in OpenStack were all in a US-based jurisdiction, which you kind of have to ask yourself the question, if the security front door is not multinational, how much of your digital sovereignty have you really captured? And you can kind of see that thread going through other parts. Security is the easiest one to highlight because I feel like people sit up and pay attention when you say security, but things like making sure you're running the latest Python version and making sure your dependencies are up to date and stuff kind of fall in that category too.
Yeah, there's, I don't know how much you're tracking the implementation and process around Europe's Cyber Resilience Act. I know Fungi is, I see him on some calls every now and then, but I haven't seen you on those, so I don't want to assume. Suffice to say,
our viewers definitely haven't been, so why don't we dig into it a little bit, give some folks some context.
So the Cyber Resilience Act is a really landmark piece of legislation in Europe that creates a legal entity called an open source steward and defines responsibilities for stewards. Early drafts of it that got leaked would have done some harmful things for open source projects writ large and like contributing to open source or publishing open source. I'm really happy to say none of that happened. Those drafts got revised. The final version of it is really good for open source, but it makes clear that every manufacturer who uses open source, which, let's be real, is all of them, has an obligation both to perform due diligence to make sure that all the open source that they're using in their products is safe, is up to date, has good vulnerability handling and coordination policies, that they know who to contact if they find a vulnerability in the open source project that they've used. And here's the real fun part. This law establishes an obligation of manufacturers that if they find a vulnerability in open source, they have to go tell the open source project. And if they fix it, they have to share the fix. So if companies follow this, then we should see a bunch more engagement in open source, at least where companies are using a project in their products. They should already be doing this. They should already be involved, but now there's a more of a legal incentive for them to as well.
So I'm kind of curious from like an open source project side of that, like on the receiving end of it. I'm going to be honest, when I think about, the intersection of regulation and security, I think about the endless PCI scanners. I think about
and checkboxes, so many checkboxes.
Exactly. Checking the boxes, filling out the forms in triplicate.
Yeah.
And often it's less about actually making things more secure and more about proving that you're doing things you're already doing. So as an open source project, how can we sort of encourage companies to take that second step of depth into it, right?
Do the right thing rather than just check the box.
Exactly. Well, I also don't want to spend my entire day fielding VMT inquiries from companies. I want them to get more integrated, right? Like I want to be to get them involved, like I said, in that second step, in that ongoing, not just when something blows up. Like how has your work kind of thinking about open source supply chain sort of intersect with that?
So there's a lot of education that still needs to happen around this all over the world. And any company putting a product in the market in Europe, this law applies to them. It's not just European companies, not just European open source developers. It applies to any company selling a product in Europe. Their developers anywhere and their projects they're taking from anywhere would, probably mitigate the risk of getting overwhelmed by the army of checkbox fillers, checklist checkers, by, documenting their compliance process. Like many projects, certainly OpenStack, since way early on, even some of the founding principles of OpenStack was multiple people doing code review, having a solid CI system, both on proposal and on merge, as well as continual release checking, signed releases, signed commits, all of the good hygiene of a large project. That's expected. Of course, a lot of small projects don't have the time, resources, or staff to do all of that. Every project would benefit if they intend on being used in a commercial setting of just having a little document, like next to your license.txt file or your contributing.md file, have a compliance.md file. It says, hey, here's how to report a vulnerability. And here's roughly what we are doing to manage releases and roughly when you can expect the next release. Like just a little bit to help manufacturers who are going to have to do this compliance checkbox to not overwhelm the open source projects with checkbox requests. Put a little bit in your repo or your project documentation, and that should be enough.
So one of the things that, and this is part of the reason I said supply chain in that in the previous question, that I struggle with is it seems almost like endless complexity if you're trying to march down a dependency tree of a project. Like if I was a company in that situation.
That's fractal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a massive amount of complexity. So how do you sort of manage that complexity? How deep is too deep to go? And like as an OpenStack developer, how much should I care about the requirement of a requirement of a requirement down my stack?
Jay, you and I both, I'm sure, can't remember them anymore, but like I know it happened lots of times when a requirement 5 or 10 levels down broke the CI pipeline. And we had to dive in and go find it and figure it out and either pin the version while someone built a patch or whatever. So of course they matter. And vulnerabilities buried deep in the stack don't always manifest, but they can. Now there's a tension there because a lot of the manufacturers don't want to have to go all the way down. They don't want to have a complex SBOM, but the open source projects kind of depend on it ourselves. And so I started a project about 5 years ago now called Omnibor.
Can you spell that for me?
Omni, like universal, Bill of Receipts, BOR.
Okay. And we'll make sure there's a link to that project in the description for anyone listening.
It's still kind of a nascent project. It's a standard with a bunch of tools for different languages. The dream of this tool is if we could just embed one small change in open source compilers, then they would automatically link together all up and down the supply chain, a digital fingerprint of all of the components and all the things that you built, so that final Docker image you're distributing or whatever it is, it would have a small hash, the same size as a git commit hash. That's it. And that's the fingerprint of the tree of all of the dependencies all the way down every single layer. And with that tree, then you can cross-reference it later on. You find out that, there's a major vulnerability in some tiny little library. Am I affected by it? You could just cross-reference the hash tree for every piece of software you're running, and you'd know immediately which ones were definitely not affected or possibly affected because they contain it. I think this would drastically improve global vulnerability coordination and response so that the next time there's a log4shell, every company can find it quickly and see which systems might be affected. But there's been a lot of resistance to implementing this. Manufacturers, in particular companies, they're lobbyists in America, they're lobbyists in Europe, have all been pressuring standards bodies and governments and just saying that SBOMs are too complicated. Like we can maybe do SBOM depth equals 1, but more than that is too much. And something like Omnivore is SBOM depth equals infinite, the bottom of the stack. Yeah, so like there is this tension. I want to see the world have better vulnerability coordination and tracking ability. And manufacturers want to manage the complexity, and they don't want to have transparency because they think sharing the detailed SBOM, it might share their intellectual property, it might devalue their product. I don't know. They're concerned. They have all kinds of things they're concerned about, but none of them seem to be about making software safer, is what I want to do.
Yeah. Oh gosh, you've hit like 1,000 different things. I wish I could ask all the follow-up questions simultaneously. I will say the one thing that this reminds me of in a positive way is the reproducible build efforts that some Linux distributions have gone through, where, with the reproducible builds, that's where you're trying to make it so that if I build the source deb on my machine, it's going to produce the exact same code that source deb would on someone else's machine, assuming same compiler versions and things like that, which would sort of feed into this idea of Omnivore being able to say, like, I can confidently say if I'm running this version of, distro, that this is the hash of my Apache binary. And, we talked about kind of the PCI checkbox hell. I would much rather have you're running a hash of Apache I don't recognize, provide me your SBON proving that it's not vulnerable, rather than, having to write, no, this is the RHEL version of the package, it's not vulnerable 500 times on a report, which if everyone who's been a sysadmin in the 2000s who processed payment information has probably done that before, right? Like,
yeah, there's a lot of sort of overlap in the desired beneficial outcome between Omnivore and reproducible build. The projects are pretty compatible. We've talked with them over the years. And there's also overlap. I don't know if you are familiar with Nix and Nixos, but they too have a hash-based identifier and effectively an artifact dependency graph for their entire package management or build management system. It's all based on the same mathematical functions, or at least similar enough ones. They just use a different hash algorithm than Omnivore, but the net effect is the same. If everyone were using Nix, and you say, well, this particular hash of a file in your source tree causes a vulnerability, is your current Nix system using that hash? Yes or no? It's a really simple question once you have this kind of a build system. I think the beauty of Omnivore is you don't have to switch to using Nix, but the downside is we would have to go change GCC and Rust compiler and Go compiler and Docker build and like all the other tools to get a little patch in them. We've never done
I honestly
that.
feel like that's less. I don't know if this is a reflection of my seniority in the open source community, or maybe work with Gentoo or something that sort of makes me associate, but that doesn't seem as impossible as it might would have seemed 10 or 15 years ago.
Right? And like, I think if we could just get this one little patch into the 10 most widely used open source compilers, it would catch on. The utility would be obvious at that point, and more people would do it.
And realistically, and I know this is kind of always a dirty secret in open source, I feel like that the inflection point is really convincing the major distro vendors to implement it. Like if Red Hat wants this to happen, it's going to end up implemented in enough places that it'll work. If SUSE wants this to happen, it's going to end up implemented in enough places to work and that sort of thing. The other thing I wanted to dig into here, though, is you made a comment about how like there's a little bit of resistance in companies to wanting to dig this deep. And something that I always think about is how easy it is to externalize costs when you're using open source. And we see lots of examples in today's world of sort of companies being able to take advantage of community resources, even in ways beyond open source. Like I think climate change is a key example of that, where, because we're not able to measure the cost of an effect of something on society, it's really hard to quantify what the deal is with it. And I think there might be a similar thing here with open source security, especially with the going 5 levels deep in dependencies of, if you know how bad it is, then you sort of have a responsibility to fix it. So like, do you think some of this is about, shining light on those debts that have maybe been piling up, that it's time for them to get paid?
Yeah, about 5 or 6 years ago now, in my talks and my keynotes, you mentioned, yes, I do a few talks. I think in the past 4 months, I think I've probably done 12 or 15 public talks. Yeah, a lot these days. But back in about 2019, 2020, I started talking about this idea of externalized risk, not just externalized cost, but externalized risk into the commons that companies keep doing with open source. And I think it was, fall of 2021 is when I started using the phrase profit-motivated insecurity. Back in the early days of the internet that I remember, I think you do too, we had terms like shareware and freemium were for different flavors of, well, technically this part of the product is open source, but if you really want to use it, you need to buy certain features. And that model is alive and well. It's just run by large trade associations now. Linux Foundation and others have an entire industry built around making a common open source core, while companies withhold security essential capabilities. You want to do a secure rolling upgrade? Got to pay for it. You want to plug in your favorite monitoring and observability service? Got to pay for that. And so on and so on. And so we have, as an industry, open source has become so successful because of this tension where companies make a lot of profit by keeping an on-ramp that doesn't have security essential functions. And that on-ramp is free.
It's one of those things that sort of open source is almost uniquely tailored to take in this bit of, if a commercial company, if a proprietary software company is trying to split the market and draws the line such that for SSO, you need to have their enterprise plan. That might have flown, 10 or 15 years ago, but these days, who doesn't have an Office 365 or a Google Apps or some sort of IDM? Even as a small business, you're going to have that these days. It becomes like a table stakes thing. And if you're not willing to give people those features at the early stages of their company, they're going to find solutions that do. And that often is open source. I like this idea of thinking about it as externalized risk. I guess I'm trying to think if there are non-security examples of externalizing your risk in open source, because I think the security one's a little bit obvious, but I think there might be a little bit more here in terms of beyond that. Like the one that I think of a lot, and I think you're going to see the OpenStack in this, is a lot of people are relying on other people to manage things like stable branches, to manage things like long-term support. The weird juxtaposition though, and there's that's the one extreme. The other one is, I've worked for companies that are following the shareware model for open source. I really love calling it that, where they'll buy licenses to major open source distributions and not use them because they want to support those distributions and have them continue. And quite frankly, maybe have a kernel developer on call if you get a really nasty bug.
So often you need that,
Yeah, exactly. But that's the motivation is not I pay you money and I get software. The motivation is I pay you money. You create software and occasionally help me with it.
Yep. And there's not a great financial and legal structure for this right now. There are a few exceptions where it works, but a lot of the time it's not great. And I don't know. I'm maybe naively hopeful, perpetually, that in Europe the CRA is going to help enable new economic models to emerge as the law goes into effect and the commission adopts some delegated acts to sort of refine it over the next couple of years, maybe we'll see new models for the maintenance of open source that benefits everybody and is sustained by companies that use the open source without having to pay for sort of specific features that are not public, not open.
Well, I think I'm gonna, sort of, this is the Gross Out podcast, right? Like, I think that Gross is actually one of those models that already exist of where, a company in terms of their overall technology spend is able to set a little bit aside. They create a pool of, talented open source developers. Basically, we aren't just trying to keep the lights on. We're not just fixing bugs that G Research cares about. We're also a bunch of smart consultants. When someone are trying to figure out how to solve a problem, they can come ask us and have, I'm the cloud guy, right? Like, but we've got, the fast Python speed up expert, right? Like the same guy who I got to call on with a gross hat on to go help with the eventlet migration in OpenStack, right? Like, and so I think there's a little bit of a model here of that if you can get out of this like chain of thinking about what's happening over the next quarter and start thinking about it on a horizon of a year or 2 or 3 years, that investing in open source as a dedicated project, as a dedicated group, whether it be inside your CTO office or whatever, can be a good way to sort of penetrate this and make a big difference.
That's an interesting point. I'm gonna bounce off what you just said.
Yeah.
Using open source is a tactical decision, right? You, as a business, you make that choice for the next quarter.
Yeah.
But contributing a little bit to open source is just over the horizon. You recognize that it's more efficient in the long run if you push that patch upstream rather than carry the technical debt internally. But developing new open source projects is a 10-year investment.
Like, I think there's even a shorter horizon you can think of there, and that's that naturally most people are running old versions of their open source software. Like OpenStack is an example of this. And so, if you've got an environment that's trailing behind, either maybe they're just using the enterprise Linux version of the given piece of software that ships, then sometimes even seeding in the features that you're going to need in a year or 2 into the releases as they're happening means that they're waiting for you ready. It's not, it's almost comfortable, right? Like you can work those enhancements into like a normal upgrade cycle, into the normal way the business does things. And instead of it becoming, I want a big thing, big project, this is constantly making it better.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean by Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3. Horizon 1 is like what you're going to need next quarter, select which open source use. Horizon 2 is planning a year or 2 out, pushing things upstream. But then Horizon 3 is like 10 years from now, how do we want to get ahead of our competitors? Let's start making the investments to make a whole new project that changes the way the industry thinks about some problem.
So I'm asking this question because I feel like we've definitely had guests on this podcast who would make this argument. I'm a little more skeptical, but do you think that the AI-assisted or LLM-based tooling being a potential force multiplier for software development is going to have a positive impact on these sort of topics of, maybe the ignored security bits or, compliance? Do you think that those tools have a place here, or do you think maybe it goes the other direction with it being compliance-based?
I think I'm going to play a little political on this one and say a lot of people that I admire have vastly different opinions on this one. So far, I have seen generative tools largely have a negative impact on the planet, both in terms of their impact on the economy and the climate, but also their impact on individual people, their utility for harmful generated content of various types, deep fakes or hostile chatbots or spam waves, whatever it might be. Whether they might be beneficial in specific industries in a niche seems right now pretty outweighed by the harm they're causing to society writ large.
Makes sense. Even if there's some sort of help there, it's almost like it's creating new ways of abuse, new methods or avenues of abuse that have to be covered up. So that makes a lot of sense. I think in OpenStack, we've been insulated from some of that. Gosh, there are probably folks that think this is a good thing, not a bad thing. I am constantly on the fence, but you got to know how to use Garrett You got to know how to use Git pretty well. There's a high bar in that it is different than other things. It's not a high bar in other ways, but simply making it so that a person has to understand Git well enough to use Gerrit means that sort of there's a layer of vibe coders that you're completely dodging. And I mean, and I'm keeping my reply in the technical realm, and I know there are plenty of non-technical applications of the statement you just said too. So
if I could, there's two really specific technical and open source security pieces here. Earlier this year, I saw a keynote in Germany from Daniel Stenberg. He's the maintainer for curl. Curl, that little library that everyone uses to fetch things from the internet on the command line. Everyone uses it. It's in everything.
Yes.
And the curl project still has a tiny little team behind it. And they've had a bug bounty program for a number of years. I'm not sure how many. Daniel got on a keynote stage and announced that curl is ending their bug bounty program because it has been overwhelmed by AI slop.
Yeah.
And the first sort of headline that we're heading in this direction that I saw was I think the second DEF CON I ever went to back in about 2018 or 19. Senator Ron Wyden went to the AI Village to watch a talk that they had asked him to come in the room for. Senator Ron Wyden, sort of the father of the Section 230 regulation in America, and they did an AI deepfake video and audio of Senator Wyden saying a bunch of stuff that he never said. And they unveiled this in AI Village with Senator Wyden in the room watching it. And I got to see his reaction as he's watching an obviously fake video. They made it say some ridiculous stuff that wasn't harmful. It was just to demonstrate they could. But that was now 7 years ago, I think 6 or 7 years ago. Like now, this is trivially easy. So not to get too much into politics, but the same capability exists for code. You want to have a vibe coder code up a new virus, a new piece of malware. That's also trivial.
It's like the only thing stopping them is how good the prompters are for the people behind Cloud Code, and that is,
just remove the safeguards. Yeah.
I had thought of lots of things. I had not thought of the script kiddie turning into the vibe hacker, right?
So the vibe hacker is an actual problem that world governments and big security companies are trying to address right now because the sudden rise in vibe-coded malware. I saw a talk at a security conference last year that said the average time to breach for a corporate network dropped by about 90% because of generative coding. The average time to breach went from hours to minutes.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Well, we're reaching the end of the podcast, and this is usually where I talk about having a gross moment. That's pretty gross, but it's gross and sad. And part of the reason we like talking and asking folks about a gross moment in their career open source is because, we know it's not always a smooth path from A to B as you're getting where you're going in your career. And there might be bumps or headaches. And, even for someone as successful as Æva, there's been a bump along the way. So can you maybe share one of those with our listenership and, sort of the journey you went through to overcome it?
Yeah, I thought a lot about different bumps because 26 years, there have been a lot of bumps. And at this point, I'm about 10 years away from having actually written code for a living. And I think the one I want to talk about is that window of about 2 years from when I stopped writing code to when I got back into tech, and like maybe a couple years after that. There was a friend of mine, colleague, cloud open source security overlap. Not going to say his name, but like we worked together on and off for years. We lived in the same city. We'd see each other for happy hour all the time. And for a number of reasons, my career took a pretty heavy break. I was trying to get back into the industry after having not written code and not had a sort of high profile on everyone's mind out on the talk circuit job for a while. And his career, meanwhile, had been really succeeding. Folks might understand it's a little bit tricky to break back into the industry not as a man. Somewhat different. And one day he and I were sitting, I think it was on the steps outside of a conference having a beer. And he's like, "Why are you sad?" And I'm like, "Well, you're super successful giving all these talks on these things that I taught you." And he's like, yeah, because you're amazing. And you taught me all those things. Wait, are you? Oh, but you're sad. Oh, your career is really taking a dive right now. How can I help? We had this big heart-to-heart about some of the struggles I had faced interpersonally in those like gap 4 years. And he did the most awesome thing and said, well, I can't do too much. I can't give you a job. You have a job, but you may not like it. But I can invite you to this thing that I'm going to. Because, Eva, I'm sure you'll do the thing that you do. I don't think I need to do more than this, but like, let me know. I'm always here. And 6 months later, I got invited to an event called Hackers on the Hill, which is a little meetup that the White House was hosting for a number of years. And nobody else in that room knew who I was. They didn't know my OpenStack background or any of my work with Kubernetes or any of that stuff. But I ended up, just because I had opinions about open source and how to make open source a little bit safer. Some of the hosts there asked me to go off and have a conversation with them. And little did I know that they would write down some of the things I said. And then 6 months later, it came out in, there's a lot of time going by in this story. The National Cybersecurity Strategy actually had a few pieces of what I had said in that random. I got invited to an event by an old friend whose career was rocking while mine sucked. And then after the White House published the National Cybersecurity Strategy, they called me up and said, hey, can you help us do the thing that you said? So point of the story is never forget your friends. Little tiny things you do for people. He and I would have a beer and I'd talk about how to hack Kubernetes. That became his big career pivot was around all of that. And then years later, when I was struggling, he gave me an opportunity to go meet some people at an event. And that became a huge pivot for my career. So always stay in touch and pay attention to the small things and pass it on.
There's a couple things there specifically that I think young people, and one is the hallway track at a conference. Yeah. Like you can make lifelong friends there. You can get referred into a job. You can get just, go to a conference, get out there, go to your local meetups, talk to people, shake hands. There are lots of nice people who want to sit with you on steps outside and help you through whatever you're going through. And I'm sometimes that guy on either side of that. The other thing is, don't doubt what you're capable of, right? Like if you're a smart, capable person and you're waiting on that opportunity, the opportunity might come around for you. And I'm glad it came around for you. And in a lot of ways, you were the person on the step for me. Like I said this before we started recording, that, if you believe in the butterfly effect, like Æva in a lot of ways was the butterfly flapping their wings in the OpenStack community, which created Ironic and sort of created this place where I found a career in at the intersection of like system administration, DevOps, and software development. So for that, I'm thankful for you. I'm also, I want to always say thank you to G Research for giving us this platform to have a talk about open source and sort of the various places it leads. If you're in London, UK, and you want to check out one of our events, go to gresearch.com. We always have smart people giving talks and lots of cool things happening, or maybe even you're looking for a job, you can check out for vacancies. But for now, on behalf of myself, Jay Faulkner, our guest, Æva, producer, Ben, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. This has been the GR-OSS OUT Podcast. Have a nice day.